Всіх вітаю. Thank you very much for attending the next session of the conversation that I and my good friend and colleague Rajan Mennon will be leading. Those of you who've attended in the past will know that this is it's just a freewheeling, laid-back conversation about the war, about Russia, about Ukraine. And it will be, of course, conducted in English, so we trust and hope that isn't a problem for any of our listeners. I'd like to thank the Ukrainian Free University, and especially its rector, Dr. Maria Pushlak, for sponsoring this event. It was her idea, and thanks to her and her excellent assistants, Mr. Vitaly and Ms. Olha, we're actually here on, online, live, to talk about the events in Ukraine, in Russia during the war. I'm Alexandr Мотиль, professor of political science at Rutgers University. I'm also a professor at the Ukrainian Free University. And my friend and colleague is Professor Emeritus at the City University of New York, Rajan Menon. Rajan Menon and I have known each other for over 30 years. And what you are witnessing is, in a way, a continued conversation that he and I have had for this period of time. Anyway, so much for the introductions. Thank you all for being here. Raj, the ball is in your court. Why don't you start the discussion?
So, Alex, we've been talking about this war almost incessantly since it began, but even actually before it began, because we had this debate about whether it would begin. And It's been full of surprises. And you have argued consistently, and I've been mildly skeptical, that this war may not just end with Ukraine's victory and Putin's defeat, but it could end with the end of Putin. So I was wondering if you could explain where you stand now, whether you've changed your mind in any way, and what you think his vulnerabilities are, and what we might expect. Not precisely, but at least in terms of possible outcomes.
Sure. Well, the reason for my pessimism, or if you prefer optimism with regard to Putin, stemmed from two factors. One is that I've been arguing for a longer period of time, as you know, that the regime that Putin constructed, I call it fascist, that's become fashionable nowadays, but whether it's authoritarian, fascist, or something in between, ultimately doesn't matter. But in any case, my point has been that this is a brittle regime. Despite the outward appearances, it's actually weak for a whole bunch of reasons. Given this kind of regime, a weak, brittle regime, all it takes is a shock to the system, obviously a big shock to the system, to possibly undermine it. And that shock occurred on February 24th. Despite the fact that most people expected the war to turn out somewhat differently, it was clear within a few weeks that the Ukrainians were not, well, within a few days, actually, it was clear that the Ukrainians would not be pushovers, and that this would be a prolonged struggle, perhaps even a quagmire. And it was clear as well, I mean, within a few weeks, if not that, within a few months, that Putin had miscalculated in a very significant fashion. So much so that his regime, and of course he himself, were potentially in danger. That's kind of the backdrop to my beliefs that Putin was likely to be deposed and or forced out of office and or become the victim of a coup d'etat and so on. And I've written a number of pieces over the last few months arguing that this is quite possible, given circumstances in Russia, given the comparative examples of other countries that have experienced coups, and so on. I've become even more persuaded that this is possible in the last month. For one thing, there is the complete humiliation that Putin was subjected to at the meeting in Samarkand. This is now about 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, time flies. He was humiliated by having to justify himself before Xi of China. He was humiliated by the fact that the president of Kyrgyzstan came late for a meeting with Putin. He was humiliated in a subsequent meeting of a number of presidents organized by Erdogan of Turkey, in which he was forced to sit lower than Erdogan. At roughly the same time, Modi of India berates him for the war.
In public.
In public, no less. In public, exactly. So there is that catastrophe, which simply signals that he is isolated internationally amongst, I mean, of course, he never quite enjoyed the favor of the Europeans or the Americans, but these were his friends, these were his buddies, these were the people who were supposed to support him. And obviously they're having second thoughts. Oh, and the General Assembly vote, which obviously adds fuel to the fire. Then he calls forth the mobilization. And, you know, people have been warning him on his side and on our side of the debate that this is a bad idea, that you don't want to do this. And if you do this only under very specific circumstances where you can actually make the claim that the motherland is in danger or something to that effect. And instead, he calls for this mobilization. It immediately elicits anger, discontent, and outrage. At this point, the number of Russian men who left Russia seems to be over 1 million. In any case, it's a ton. So clearly the move is unpopular. They've drafted soldiers and in many cases have sent them without any training, without any equipment to the front. There have been cases of Russians being killed after only 4 days after having been mobilized. There are cases of Russians surrendering after 6 days or 5 days after having been mobilized. Clearly, this is not a good idea. And of course, the 1 million or so men who left are, in general, young, professional, and affluent. Many of them are owners of small or medium-sized businesses. I mean, this is simply no way to run an economy. It's also no way to run a war. And of course, the body bags are beginning to return, along with the demoralization on the front. So just yesterday, Ukrainian sources revealed that some 60 recently mobilized soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian side in Kherson Oblast. Just today, I read an account that in Luhansk Oblast, some 27 Russian soldiers refused to go to the front. 22 were arrested, 5 changed their minds and eventually did go. Clearly, there is something afoot on the front. There is dissatisfaction, there's anger. It may be too soon to compare these desertions to those that occurred on the Russian front in World War I in 1916 and 1917. It seems to go in that particular direction. And then the annexation, just a bad idea. Not so much because, you know, one wants to defend Ukraine's sovereignty, but it was just a half-assed idea. And it was clear from the audience that was listening to Putin's celebration of the annexation, it was clear from their faces that they weren't exactly ecstatic. And it seems clear to me that the Russian elites are finding much wrong with Putin and his most recent actions. And all of those sorts of findings have been, or at least some of these conclusions have been supported by by other observers, by other analysts, Russians, Ukrainians, Christo Grozev of Bellingcat, and they all point to growing fragmentation within the elites, growing dissatisfaction within the elites, and so on. Now, does this mean that Putin will be overthrown tomorrow? No, but it means that the chances of his being overthrown are increasing. Now, where exactly are they? I have no idea. I mean, I suspect it's more than 25%, but that's just a off-the-cuff kind of guess. So Putin is in trouble, and because Putin is in trouble, his regime is in trouble because it's so centered on him. He spent 20 plus years building this regime, and he's the core of the regime. So if he goes, the regime will be in trouble as well. And then it's anybody's guess. Can Russia survive as a state? Again, it may be premature to ask that question, or maybe premature to answer that question, but it's probably not premature to start thinking about that question and what it all means for Russia, for Ukraine, for its neighbors, and of course for the geopolitics of Eurasia. Anyway, so I see the writing on the wall for Putin. I think he does too. And these recent waves of attacks on civilians suggest to me that he's really kind of grasping for straws, knowing that there isn't much he can do on the front. So the only thing that you can do is lash out at the civilians. Back to you, Raj.
So, we have to, I think, take seriously that the war could lead to a political change in Russia just by going back to Russian history. So if you think of what happened after the Crimean War, after the War of 1904, 1905, War of 1917, and almost in the War of 1941, but not quite. So it's not plausible. And I have to say, I've become somewhat more convinced of your theory as time goes by. Not the first time that you persuaded me that I was wrong and you may be right. Because the criticism of the war now isn't just Navalny or opposition figures who can be dismissed as outside the system, or Garry Kasparov or Khodorkovsky, who are in exile. It's coming from within the system. Ramzan Kadyrov, horror of horrors, he's the second most popular person in Russia after Putin. Margarita Simonyan, the editor-in-chief of RT, staunch regime supporter. The deputy of the chair of the Duma's Defense Committee, a former general, who said, we have to stop lying about the war. People are not stupid. And then this extraordinary thing by the governor Putin appointed to oversee occupied Kherson, who said of Shoigu, who's become now the target of criticism, that any other real soldier, he was alluding to the lack of military service on the part of Shoigu, would commit suicide if he were a true officer. Now, this is really kind of extraordinary. The problem the elite faces is that they are all so closely connected to Putin. But as you point out, his downfall is their downfall. Now, would they try to save the system by putting someone else in his position to make things look better? As you know, the American expression would be, that's like putting lipstick on a pig, right? Pig looks somewhat better, but it still remains a pig. And if so, will a new person, let's assume that it's someone like Alexander Borotnikov, the head of the security service. These guys have all kind of embraced the war, and so will they change the war? So one possibility is Putin goes and the war continues. Another possibility is sort of chaos in the country. And this, I think, some people would welcome it. I would look at Russia, which is such a very large country with thousands of nuclear warheads, and wonder, have we ever seen a nuclear country that is in the state of chaos and potentially bloodletting? Because the chaos could lead to a situation where it spins out of control and every effort is made to try to keep the country whole. Now, there are people who expect democracy at the end of this, and it would be a very nice thing if that happened. But I think that there's too much focus here on the expectation that democracy will occur. I can see other outcomes as well. Just a couple of other observations. I think the attacks on Kiev and other cities, about 14 or 15 by my count, including Lviv in the far west, it hasn't been attacked for a very, very long time, is a sign of desperation. So is the appointment of Surovikin, this general who has killed people in 1991 who were demonstrating. He was in the war in Chechnya, before that in Afghanistan, and he was in Syria, reduced the city of Aleppo to rubble. The problem with appointing somebody like him and these attacks on civilian structures, including parks and playgrounds and so on, the research on this suggests that this kind of bombing of civilians has the opposite of the intended effects. And I think I've told you, based on my trips to Ukraine, I never met anybody who said, oh, the suffering is so much that we have to cut a deal with Putin. Nobody. I never met a single person. I didn't conduct a poll in Ukraine, but I didn't meet a single person. It was very, very striking. So the war is clearly being lost. Just yesterday on the Lugansk front, big reverses. Now the Russians are evacuating telling people to get out of Kherson. So this is really going very, very badly. In the shadows of all this, right, is the nuclear question. So I wanted to just pivot to that for a second. So what are we to make of this statement from Medvedev? In a sense, even from the foreign minister Lavrov, he was asked, the territories that have been annexed to Russia, will they be covered by Russian nuclear weapons protection? And he said, all of our doctrines apply to all parts of the country. And then Medvedev, who said, well, if we lob a nuclear weapon in Eastern Europe, what will the Americans do? Will they really start a nuclear war with Russia? I mean, this could be all intimidation, could be that they're serious and desperate. What are we to make of this?
Just today, I read another report. This was an interview given by Lukashenko of Belarus to, I think it was NBC.
Always lovely to hear from him.
Yeah. But he was saying, for what it's worth, Russia has no intention, no interest in using nuclear weapons. He was very adamant on this particular point and said, and instead they've got these fantastic conventional weapons and those will be more than sufficient, and so on and so forth.
Where have these weapons been all this time? Where
have they been for these last 7 months? Exactly. But one is getting these mixed signals. Some people say there's a possibility of these, others say that this will never happen, it's just a non-starter. And I think that's intentional on the part of the Russians. It's partly possible, I guess, that there's just confusion and chaos within the regime and people are simply mouthing off. That's a possibility. Again, we can't exclude that. The other possibility is that, the evil Wizard of Oz is manipulating these statements and telling Medvedev, you sound crazy today, telling Lukashenko, you sound reasonable tomorrow. That strikes me as being perfectly plausible as well. And with the intent of that being precisely what you and I are experiencing at this moment, confusion, a certain degree of fear, and sort of scratching our heads as to what this can possibly mean and what should possibly be done. In all honesty, I have no idea what the answer to that particular question is. I can come up with probably about 15 excellent reasons for why this would be an idiotic move by Putin. I can only come up with maybe one persuasive reason for doing it. So, given the logic, he shouldn't. But given the logic, he shouldn't have invaded on February 24th. You and I argue that he wouldn't because he was stupid. And it turned out to be stupid, but he did anyway. So who knows?
So I've been thinking about this. And here's what I see. On the one hand, these threats to use nuclear weapons have gotten everybody's attention. And there's a lot of concern in the US about the need to avoid nuclear Armageddon, and to come to a settlement. Now, I get a little impatient with this because, yes, would I like the war to end? Of course. But I don't see any basis for a political settlement.
Yeah.
Because Putin has not only annexed 4 Ukrainian provinces, not all of which he controls fully. He controls about half of Donetsk, for example. He said in this bizarre ceremony of goose-stepping soldiers delivering documents and so on, that they're now eternally part of the Russian Federation. They've come back home. Now, this is another really stupid move, because let's assume there's supposed to be some peace negotiation. Can he now give back territory that he himself has declared as part of the Russian Federation? I submit to you that short of a collapse, that won't happen. So what is the compromise that Ukraine is supposed to accept? Partition and neutrality? Nobody in Ukraine is going to accept that, especially now, given the military momentum. So there's a lot of hand-wringing about the need to do something, the need for political settlement. And I've asked people, okay, let's talk about it. What do you have in mind? And nobody comes up with, they say, well, Ukraine can be made neutral. I said, okay, Zelensky actually offered that after the war began, as you know, in March. But now the facts on the ground are such that the Ukrainians would have to say, we are willing to give up about, 15% of our territory, 18 if you add Crimea, something like that. And I never encountered anybody who said that they're prepared to do that. And why would they do that now that they feel that they're winning?
They're winning, exactly.
So
I agree with you completely. These are pie in the sky scenarios or recommendations. And President Macron of France most recently, I mean, I'd actually go even further. I just don't see what there is to talk about with the Russian leadership, given their insistence on complete capitulation as the only option on the table.
Right.
A, that's just a non-starter, but B, even if that were to be something to talk about, why should the Ukrainians, since they're winning, as you say? I mean, if you want to talk about capitulation, how about talking about Russia's capitulation, demilitarization, denazification, and neutrality? To a large degree, so much of this debate is unreal. I mean, it's founded on these absurd assumptions that simply have no relationship to the reality. You raised an interesting point. Well, a number of, obviously, but one of the points that I just thought I'd pursue here briefly and then lob the ball back to you. Would it be possible in this scenario of a kind of post-Putin Russia for a faction? Again, I'm assuming that in the immediate aftermath of post-Putin, there will be something like a power struggle, which may last a few days and may last a few years, right? Based on Russian or Soviet history, we know that. And within that power struggle, during that power struggle, it's almost inevitably going to be the case that you've got the hardliners, the softliners, I mean, whatever that means in the Russian context. But would it be possible for one of the factions, let's call them the softliners for the sake of argument, to argue that the war needs to be concluded? In other words, do a kind of Gorbachev vis-a-vis Afghanistan. This is going nowhere. Obviously, the losses are unacceptable. At this point, the Ukrainians estimated 65, 66,000, and there are 2 Russian sources that seem to corroborate that. Well, in any case, whatever the exact number, they're unacceptable, and let's just end this. Obviously, the hardliners will oppose this. Obviously, a portion of the population will as well. But it's conceivable that a portion of the population, and certainly a good portion of the elite, might say, yes, let's just end this thing and see if we can put our relations with Ukraine, the West, the US, the world, how about the world, back on a normal footing. Do you see that as being in any way remotely possible?
After everything we've seen in the war, because initially I thought that the Russians would overrun Kiev very quickly. I never expected the kind of resistance, and I underestimated the changes that have occurred in the Ukrainian army. You know, one of the things we missed is that they had a lot of combat experience in the Donbass, but beyond that, there's been substantial Western training. So they've moved away completely from the Soviet-style centralized decision-making. They have an entirely different way of running their military, and it's very much a military that looks more and more like a Western military. On top of that, they have people like Zaluzhny and Siersky who are just, you know, brilliant commanders. They're just unbelievable. I'd watch for a couple of things in terms of the possibility of change. The first is, are they forced to withdraw their troops that are now in a very tenuous position from the right bank of the Dnipro, or call it the left bank, whatever you, it's the west bank, call it the right bank. Will that happen? That will be something very, very significant. The second is, will we see something we've never seen before? Even in a veiled manner, some criticism of Putin himself. And who will make that criticism? Because I submit to you that anyone who makes it from within the inner circle will not make it without some assurance that all males, has someone to some critical mass of people, so that that individual is not exposed and just, you know, his head is cut off, right? So I'd watch for that. The third thing I'd watch for is look at the first humiliation, the destruction of the Moskva, the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, about which we'd heard it can defend against all these missiles and so on. And now the attack on Kherson. And I think I've told you this, I have friends who are American military officers who know a lot about truck bombs. And they completely discredit the truck bomb theory. They just think it just does not work for a number of reasons. I don't have time to get into them here, or nor they fully the expertise. They almost certainly think it was a missile. And they think it was the ATACMS missile, the Army Tactical Missile, which the Ukrainians have asked for a long time and have not been given. How did they get it? I don't know. But everyone who I know who understands this thinks it's a missile attack. Let's leave aside whether it was a missile attack or a truck bomb. It was a gigantic symbolic humiliation. So if there's one more, and I can't think of what it might be, right? Then at some point, the narrative that everything is going well just cannot hold up anymore. Now, the question for me is there a Gorbachev in the wings? Now, remember that, I mean, you remember this, and our friends who are listening remember this. It took 10 years of a failed war in Afghanistan before there was a discussion about whether to get out. And Afghanistan they could get out of because at the time it wasn't a border state of, well, it was a border state of the Soviet Union, but not of Russia. Ukraine is a different matter altogether, it seems to me. I think there's a, beyond Putin, I don't know what portion of public opinion supports this, but the right-wing nationalists certainly do. So I think the business of terminating the war, someone will have to do it, but they will meet with a lot of opposition, which is why I think one can expect a lot of turbulence, political upheaval. If somebody goes down that road, what will the military do? What will the FSB do? Do the military and the FSB think this was a disaster from the beginning? We should just get out of this? I would think they do. So that's my sense. You know, I don't know what will happen. We're just in a, the only thing I do know for sure is the situation on the ground is getting worse and worse for the Russians. I don't think anybody would deny that that's the case. There are friends of mine who say, oh, the Russian army will come back and so on. The problem is that, you know, these problems that we've seen, morale, abandonment of equipment, logistical problems, the inability to deliver even water and repair supplies to the front, we've seen this right from the beginning. They've had 8 months to try to fix it, and they haven't. So my theory is you can't fix this by firing General Bulgakov, who was the general in charge of logistics, or getting rid of one general and bringing in Surovikin. These are systemic problems. And I don't see an early fix. There's one other thing that's notable. The Russians have an air defense system called the S-300. It's an air defense system. They've now converted it and are using it to attack civilian targets. To me, that suggests the reservoir, the supplies of missiles are running low. So I have another question for you, though, on a different subject. So Europe's economy is in terrible shape. The British economy is being wrecked in a matter of weeks by Prime Minister Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, her finance minister, chancellor of the exchequer. The Ukrainian economy is under enormous stress. Enormous stress. I mean, you know all the numbers and the statistics. Do you worry that if the war persists for longer than we might think, say a year, say 2 years, coupled with the Russian attacks on infrastructure, waterworks, power, the electricity grid, power plants, and so on, that the Russian strategy might change and say, okay, we can't defeat the Ukrainians on the field, but we'll just make it impossible for them to continue the war because we will basically destroy the economy. Meanwhile, Western Europe will be in such a mess that it won't be able to provide the kind of aid that has been given so far. Again, we don't know, but have you thought about this? Do you have any thoughts about this?
A little bit. Economic issues are a little beyond my expertise, as you know.
Yeah, mine too, but
that said,
stop me from venturing opinions.
Of course not, right? That said, I think that view, that argument, first of all, it is obviously, it raises issues of serious concern. At this point, I believe the Ukrainian economy has shrunk by about a third. Well, if you just project this into the future, and of course, projections are not predictions, we all know that, but nevertheless, if you project that into the future, in 2 years, it'll be zero, at this particular rate. Now, but that presupposes the ability and willingness of Russia to sustain that kind of pressure as well, to maintain and sustain that kind of pressure. Because just as the Ukrainian economy is shrinking, obviously far more significantly than the Russian one, but the Russian one is as well. And the prospects for an immediate uptick in the Russian GDP are, well, slim and non-existent. Negative growth is likely to be the norm for the foreseeable future. The departure of over 1 million talented professionals is hardly likely to help Russia. Anyway, so if you project these other factors, then essentially what you see is it's not just Russia which is exerting influence on Ukraine and its economy, but we see that the war, the sanctions, as well as the Ukrainian experience on the battlefield is exerting, well, perhaps not an equivalent, but certainly a similar kind of impact on the Russian economy. And then the question becomes, or rather the appropriate metaphor might be something like a game of chicken. I mean, who can survive the pressure longer? And given the destruction, given the decline in economic welfare and so on. And there the answer is, I don't know. But it does seem clear, though, that it's not immediately clear that just the Ukrainians would be suffering. I would venture or hazard a guess, and this is purely hypothetical, given such circumstances where both economies are suffering, where both populations are suffering, I would wager that the Ukrainians will have more stamina and persistence and resolve to slog through this, simply because they have no alternative and because they're mad as hell. And they see that they want payback of some kind or other. There is an element within the Russian population that probably shares those views vis-a-vis Ukrainians, but I'm guessing that most Russians don't have as much of a stake in the fight as do the Ukrainians. So other things being equal, I'd say that the Ukrainians can outlast the Russians. Obviously, that presupposes that the economy isn't shattered altogether. And unfortunately, the Russians do have the missiles still. I mean, their numbers are dwindling, but nevertheless, they do still have the destructive capacity to wreak a significant amount of havoc. And at that point, of course, one can start speculating. I mean, will the West help? Will the Americans help? Will the IMF help? Will the Poles help? They might, they will, they should, they could, it becomes very, very difficult to imagine anything. Oh, and last but not least, the scenario you suggested presupposes a politically stable Russia, one that has a fairly clear vision of what its strategic goals in the war are. And if that's the case, then yes, there will be a strategic goal and it will be pursued. If alternatively, we come back to the scenario we were talking about just before, namely a potential implosion of the regime, Putin's removal, a power struggle, good guys versus bad guys, something along those lines, then it's not clear to me that under such circumstances that the elites and the population will be willing to sustain further self-punishment. They might, they could, who knows?
I've been looking at the economic picture fairly closely because this is the one thing that I think is potentially the weak point for Ukraine. I was on the website of the Ukrainian National Bank the other day, and they say they expect growth actually to pick up next year. The problem, of course, is that if you have a 45 or 35% decline and you have a 3% increase, you're still much worse than where you were, right? You can't catch up to the pre-war levels. Prime Minister Shmyhal said the other day that Ukraine would need about $30 billion just to deal with its budget problems. So that's the not so good part. But there are also pressures, as you pointed out, on the Russians. And let me give you an example. So Western Europe is tipping into recession. We in the United States might, in fact, the chair of the Federal Reserve said, raising of interest rates to reduce inflation could tip the economy into a recession. China's growth rates are declining. I was on the World Bank website yesterday, and the World Bank says it is not at all impossible that there could be a global recession. Mm-hmm. And you could say this all makes things work for Ukraine. But for Russia, it means a reduction in energy prices. And 45% of the Russian state budget, so revenues come from oil and gas. That, plus the cumulative effect of Western sanctions, means that, yes, Ukraine is still economically vulnerable, but on the other side of the ledger, the other side of the page, we have to also take into account what the pressures are that could become evident in the Russian economy as well. I don't know whether there's going to be a global recession, but the Chinese growth numbers don't look very good. The European growth numbers don't look very good. Our growth numbers don't look very good. So if economies are decelerating and people are buying less oil and gas, certainly oil, that is a long-term problem. Now, OPEC could fix this by production cuts, but if you take oil off the market, you're also selling less, maybe at a higher price. But at some point, you can't just keep cutting. And I mean, technically, you could say, I'll cut it to 1 million barrels a day, and then the prices would skyrocket, but you would also lose a lot of revenue.
Exactly.
So that's kind of where I see things. But I will come back to this. If I see, I'm much less concerned about the capacity of the Ukrainian military to fight, because we've seen it for 8 months, and there's no question that they are prepared to fight. Ukraine has had a draft, Have there been any anti-draft protests? Not that I'm aware of.
Right, exactly.
There hasn't been. Okay, now people say, well, that's because Ukrainians are not allowed to leave the country. But that would make them, I think, even more predisposed to protest, and they haven't protested. There have been some desertions. There have been some people who've dodged the draft that happens in every war, but nothing compared to what we've seen in Russia. So I don't worry so much about the military side. I'm much more concerned about the economic side. Now, that said, the Europeans have promised about $8 billion in May. They've only delivered 8 billion euros. They've only delivered 2 billion euros. They've said we're going to fast track and deliver more. Yesterday, they said we're putting together a $13 billion package for Ukraine. Now, maybe they will deliver, maybe they won't, but it's not as if people in the West, much to my surprise, are saying, this is too much, we can't continue supplying them. If anything, the success of the Ukrainian military on the ground makes Ukraine look like a good bet, right? That it's not a lost cause. And so there's a lot of pressure on the Ukrainian military to deliver continued successes, because those successes then sort of trace back politically to Europe and the US and say, well, the policy is working. We shouldn't change the policy. So.
Exactly. I think that's a very important point, because when you look back 7, 8, 9 months ago, with the expectation being on the part of most policymakers and analysts that this would be a cakewalk for the Russians. And, you know, one can appreciate, I can certainly appreciate the reluctance of Western policymakers to assist Ukraine in those circumstances, because given the assumption that the place was going to crash in 3 days, why would you deliver weapons? In a way, it makes no sense. I understand from the Ukrainian point of view, it made sense nonetheless, but there's the logic works both ways. But with the progressive reassertion or assertion of the Ukrainian army's capacity to fight, first they demonstrated that they could fight back. Then they demonstrated that they could fight, demonstrated that they can actually win. And that, of course, changes the calculation altogether. Rather than placing your money on a horse that is unlikely to win, now the choice facing Europeans, Americans, and others is on placing, as well as the Chinese, the Indians, the Central Asians. Right now, the question is, I mean, do you support? Why not support a winner? Or in any case, if you don't want to support the winner, which is to say Ukraine, rather than supporting the Russians, who look like a loser, we're just not going to support anybody. We're not going to bet at all, which of course is the equivalent of non-support for Russia. So the calculation has obviously changed. And the more Ukraine is able to demonstrate that it can continue these counteroffensives successfully, and it's doing so at this point in an incremental fashion. But if it could break through in Kherson, and apparently Western sources think that next week we might even see the downfall, the liberation of the city of Kherson. Let's just assume for the sake of argument that that is in fact a realistic assessment. Then, as you said, this would be huge. It would demonstrate conclusively that the Ukrainians are on a roll, that they can win, that they probably will win. And of course, it would be disastrous for the Putin regime. It's one thing if you lose a bunch of villages or some towns that no one ever heard of, but it's something very different to lose Kherson. Especially since Putin insists that Volodymyr the Great was baptized in Kherson, and that's part and parcel of the whole kind of historical mythology that he's constructed. And suddenly, you know, you've lost the site of the baptism. Good God, what's next?
It's a procedural question. Maybe we don't have the capacity to do this, but there are people in the audience who probably have a lot of knowledge about these things. Is there an opportunity to give them a chance to ask questions or to venture opinions? If the questions are in Ukrainian or German, you'll have to translate for me. But
well, we could ask people to submit questions via chat.
Yeah. They can't speak. Is that right?
No, well, they can just click on the chat function at the bottom.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And
Yeah.
if there's a question,
know.
so by all means, those of you in the audience, if you do have questions, or if you have comments, please make them in the chat function, and I will read them, and we'll take it from there.
So we've got about 10 minutes, right?
Another 10 minutes or so, yeah.
So let me ask a question of you, because you're generally now quite optimistic. What, if anything, do you worry about? Now, you could say nothing, but there must be something.
Well, yeah, well, there are. I mean, I'm worried about the nuclear issue for obvious reasons. And the fact that I have no steadfast opinion as to how this will go only adds to the anxiety. I mean, if I had an opinion and it turned out to be wrong, well, okay, but at least I have an opinion, but I don't. I'm caught in this kind of no man's land, and I worry about that for reasons that need no explication. I am worried that I occasionally worry that the Ukrainian tendency to extrapolate internal policies onto external policies will reassert itself. And what do I mean by that concretely?
I didn't quite
yeah, well, what I mean, and I'm sorry for the lingo, what I mean by that concretely is that increasingly I see people in the press, in social media, criticizing the government in Ukraine for all sorts of reasons that are perfectly legitimate, but that have very little to do with the war per se.
Yeah.
And again, I understand that. I appreciate that. I even sympathize with some of, if not indeed much of the criticism.
You're talking about Poroshenko primarily.
Pardon?
You're talking about Poroshenko primarily.
People like him, but others as well. I mean, you know, colleagues, friends, and so on. That worries me because it seems to me that it's still a little premature to engage in the kind of internal politicking. That is a healthy sign of a healthy democracy, I grant you that. But as long as you're still fighting a war against an enemy that really does have the capacity to destroy you, it might be opportune or perhaps a little wiser to just hold back a bit.
Let me ask you, because I don't know Ukrainian domestic politics all that well. What are the complaints?
Well, that there's still continued corruption, that there is a kind of media monopoly imposed by Zelensky, that he's promoting and favoring sort of his own old boy network, that some of these people in the old boy network are of dubious provenance, and people like Yermak, who may or may not have connections with the Russian regime. And again, I get it, I understand it, and as I said, sometimes I even sympathize. But I'm obviously of two minds here, because on one hand, criticism such as this is very important and very legitimate. On the other hand, I wish it weren't taking place just now. I wish that the war would be won, and then by all means go back to business as usual and tear into each other.
So do you see
but win the war first?
Kind of just below the surface and kind of annoying, or do you see it rising?
At this point, it's just below the surface, or just slightly below the surface, and kind of potentially worrisome, all right? But I see more of it now than I did 5 months ago. And of course, 5 months ago, people weren't worried about what would happen after the war would be won, because it wasn't clear that the war would be won.
Yeah.
But now that there is a sense of...
In a sense, the more successful the war, the more people might say, oh, now we can talk about all the problems and start
exactly.
I don't know if that'll happen or not.
You know, well, it happened to Churchill, right? He wins the war and then gets voted out. And that may happen to Zelensky, deservedly so, for all sorts of reasons, having less to do with the war and perhaps having to do with his other policies. And if, if he gets voted out in a fair and free election, well, all the more power to Ukrainian democracy. But I would be inclined to wait a bit with that kind of pre-electoral politicking, rather than engaging in support.
Something along the lines of what you're talking about. By the way, my plan is to go back in December.
Oh, excellent.
To go to Mykolaiv and Odessa and other parts. I mean, depending on what exactly is going on there. So I'll have a chance to take a look again. The Biden administration's policy, on balance, are you of the mind that they've done everything that's humanly possible and they get an A+, or would you give them a B- or a B+? I mean, what's your...
No, I'm inclined to give them good grades. I'm not sure what that would be exactly.
But you're satisfied.
Pardon?
You're satisfied.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I think they could have done, should have done, and are now finally doing, is to be a little more concerned with the Ukrainian need for anti-aircraft systems.
Yeah. They're delivering. They're going to deliver them.
But they're going to deliver. So that's why I'm saying, they could have done it earlier. It is, after all, a defensive weapon. Yeah. It's not lethal. And in that sense, and of course, it would have saved lives as well as cities and infrastructure and things like that. I think they got on the bandwagon a little late.
They are going to deliver them. The Germans have just delivered them. The Germans haven't delivered a lot of weapons. By the way, 75% in dollar value of all the weapons Ukraine gets come from the United States.
Right.
So it's basically an American show. That's good and bad, because also our own inventories are drawing down, and there's going to be concern about how much can we keep giving. But the Germans have just sent an air defense system called the Iris.
Right.
There's some talk about maybe Patriot missile systems. So all that is coming, and the Patriot in particular is a very easy system to use. It doesn't require apparently much training, because if this attack on civilian structures continues, and there's no sign that they'll stop doing it, then there has to be something done to protect the civilian population, because I don't think Ukrainians will say, well, we're suffering so much, we have to sign a deal with Putin. But I think Zelensky will be asked, well, what are you doing to protect civilians? And he'll have to do that. So I don't see any change in the administration's policy. I think the one criticism I will make of the president is, I understand that he's concerned about nuclear escalation. We should all be concerned about it. But I wouldn't voice those concerns in public, because it doesn't do anything other than raise the anxiety level here. And that is precisely what Putin wants. If you want to talk about escalation, you can have back-channel communications with the Russians, explaining what your policies are and why they shouldn't do this or whatever. But I think, and also Macron said yesterday, which was, I think, completely idiotic. He said, well, French nuclear policy does not extend. Why say anything? He wasn't obliged to say anything. He could have just been strategically ambiguous. I don't think, if Ukraine is attacked, that the French will retaliate. But why go out and say that? It just doesn't make any sense to me. Sometimes, in life, if you are impelled to say something, you should just bite your tongue and not say anything. That's one of the things that I think. One other thing, by the way, there's some decline in public opinion that suggests people want a peace settlement and so on, but the support for Biden's policy in public opinion is pretty strong. And as you know, the Republicans and Democrats cannot even agree on what time of day it is. But on Ukraine policy, there's no big difference. I mean, Rand Paul, maybe some people like that, but for the most part, there's solid support. If in 2024 Trump is elected, who knows what will happen. But I don't think there's any need for Ukrainians to worry about, will the Americans continue to support us? I don't see any sign of that in the think tank community, in the press, public opinion, within the president's circle, I don't think there are people who are saying, well, we have to change gears. And partly it's because the Ukrainian army is winning.
Exactly.
That puts a huge pressure on people like Zaluzhny and others. They have to keep delivering at reasonably rapid intervals successes, even if incremental. Right? They can't afford to look like they're losing the war.
That's right.
Well, they can't afford to look like they're losing the war because they don't want to lose the war. But apart from that, right, they've got to show that the support of Ukraine is worthwhile because Ukraine is actually winning the war. Oddly enough, there's a paradox, right? The more successful Ukraine becomes, the more people will say, now we're pushing Putin into a corner. We have to give him some dignified way out. There has to be a deal. And I think as Ukraine succeeds more and more, you will have those voices. And I think Kiev could find itself, at least from some European quarters, under pressure to cut a deal. I can see a split occurring between Kiev and the West, and maybe even the US on Crimea. Let's assume it's very successful, and the Ukrainians say, we're also going to take back Crimea. I think that I could see some differences occurring between the West and Ukraine on Crimea. But I don't know what you think about that. But we've got like 3 minutes.
I think you're right. You're right. I mean, it's the homogeneity and the uniformity, the monolithic unity that we see today. I mean that with a certain element of irony. It's probably not sustainable in the long run. So all sorts of issues will arise. That said, I would just hope that we actually get to the point where Crimea becomes a bone of contention. Because if it does, then that means that Ukrainians have actually succeeded, at least in driving out the Russians from Kherson, Zaporizhzhia. Probably significant portions of Luhansk and Donetsk will have been liberated as well. And if the only major bone of contention remains Crimea, then all the more power to the Ukrainians. I would say at that point, let's cross that bridge if and when we get to it, or rather when we get to it. But in any case, that would be my...
So I'm going to use my 30 seconds to say a couple of things. We've had now 3 or 4 sessions, and there are a good number of people who've turned up to listen to us, just unusual. So thank you all for coming. I hope we find a way of getting more of you involved so you could ask questions, because I would really like to know what your views are. I mean, I'm sure there are people who are listening to us who have very strong opinions on these things, and a lot of, oh, here's a question, Alex.
Yes, what do you think about the lack of the alternative vision? Excuse me.
What do you think about the lack of alternative vision about state, history, policy in Russia without Putin? Does it help Putin to control society? This is a great question. I mean, I'll answer it very briefly because I know our time is up. I think that when you have an increasingly centralized system that relies on one person, where especially after the war, free media has ceased to exist, and you're left only with social media, it is difficult to imagine an alternative Russia because there is no political opposition. Navalny is in jail. There's no real political opposition because you have the Communist Party that's in support of the war and Zhirinovsky, the so-called Liberal Democratic Party. And so it's very difficult, I think this is a very good question for Russians to imagine, well, what comes after Putin? I think they're, on the one hand, really terrified that there'll be chaos, but also unable to think about exactly what happened. So this is a good question. I think the answer is yes. Putin's rule makes it much harder to imagine alternative visions of politics.
I would just add to that if and when Putin goes, and if and when we see some kind of serious changes within the Russian regime and possibly even within the Russian state, and all this would presumably presuppose a continued losing the war, Russians will face a very, very painful set of questions regarding themselves, their history, their identity, their statehood, their culture, their empire, questions that they've ignored for the last 23 years under Putin, questions that were beginning to be discussed in perestroika, during perestroika and glasnost in the late 1980s. I would imagine that that sort of soul sort will reemerge if and when Russia loses the war and Putin is in some ways ousted. And it will be very painful because they will confront not just the last 22 years and their willingness to support a dictator, but they will have to confront the reality of a genocidal war in Ukraine, or at least of the war crimes, the atrocities that were committed, partly as a result of their support, partly as a result of their unwillingness to confront the reality. So something along the lines of what Germany experienced, both not so much in the immediate aftermath of the war, but starting in the late 50s, early 60s, something like that will, I am certain, will affect the Russians as well.
So we're going to have to go into overtime a little bit because we have another question. Dimitri, your question was very good and we didn't do it justice. But what I propose, maybe I'll talk about it with Alex. The next session we have, he and I will talk less and we'll just throw it open to people who want to ask questions, because I genuinely would like to know what you're thinking and whether you agree or disagree. I mean, there should be a forum where we talk about this, but we'll have to answer this question and probably go, right?
I think so, yes.
Discussion, pardon me, maybe this topic has been discussed already, but if there's a chance to wake up Russians and overthrow the regime from the society by civil revolution, is it possible only on a high level? So, again, this is a really great question, and we can't do it justice, but we'll come back to both of these questions when we meet next time. Here's my thought about this. If I had to guess how political change in Russia will come, it'll be, as it always has been, a split within the elite. But that split in the elite will open up possibilities for things from below that we may not be able to even imagine. So that's the short answer. I would say something else, and maybe Alex will disagree. The United States has a terrible track record when it comes to trying to engineer the government of other countries. Think of Iraq or Libya, for example. Not that Russia is anything like those two. My own preference would be for us not to be lecturing the Russians on what they should do and overthrow Putin, because that will just feed the narrative that this is an effort to destroy Russia. Let this play out. Let the war lead to additional Ukrainian successes. Let us think there will be a split within the elite. Let us wait to see what happens from below. But I think the idea of calling on Russians to do this, that, or the other, we have, I think, very little opportunity and power to kind of organize the future of Russia. And I personally would like the United States government to have much more humility. Is another question. So, Alex, we have to do this time differently. To me, should Putin be tried in an international tribunal? Short answer. In theory, in the interest of justice, yes. Do I see it happening? I would be very, very surprised if that ever happened. So, Alex, we should probably wind this up. So why don't you take
Yes, that's right. Well, thank you, everybody. Велике всім спасибі. And we promise to incorporate you more in our future discussions. Obviously, there's interest.
We'll just maybe just throw it open after 5 minutes, okay?
Yeah, something like that.
Because clearly, we made the offer, and here are a whole bunch of questions, and so
exactly. So it works.
We'll do that, yeah.
So we'll certainly incorporate the audience as much as we possibly can. And in the meantime, let me thank you all for attending. Let me thank again the Ukrainian Free University and its rector, Maria Prushak. And last but not least, let me thank my co-conspirator, Rajan Menon, for donating his precious time. He is really, I mean that seriously, his precious time to our encounters and our meetings with you and with the audience represented by the Ukrainian Free University. So thank you again, and we will presumably repeat this session sometime in November. So keep your eyes open, and we'll inform you of when that'll be as soon as possible.
Thank you again for the time to come, and thank you to the organizers, especially to Professor Prishlak, the university, everybody else who's helped on the technical side to make this possible. And we'll see you in November. All the best.
Take care.
Take care.
До побачення.
До побачення. Дякую. Thank you.